The Supreme Court has just ruled against churches being open. How are we supposed to see this as anything else other than a shot at the First Amendment?
It's not a surprise that Roberts went the way he did, given he'd already done it, but there's no good basis for it. I mean, the law had been clear. They'd already dramatically restricted the scope of the First Amendment as applies to religious expression, because my view is any law that burdens religious expression should meet strict scrutiny. That's not what the Supreme Court has said. They have said only if the law discriminates between churches and other people. And I've never thought that should be the standard. But putting that aside, even under the discriminatory standard, clearly the California case met it, and the Nevada case was even worse because Governor Sisolak here we have in Nevada, he's a disgrace. But he basically said, but of course, one thing I love about Nevada is the casinos run this state. So we will always have some degree of business reasonableness because if it benefits the casinos, it will benefit us. But what he's created a huge distinction where basically he's not going to interfere with the casinos. He went along with what they said they needed. It's still not working economically, unfortunately, but then he kept the crazy rules for the churches without adjusting them to reflect how he had adjusted the rules for the casinos. And Roberts, I was curious to see whether Roberts would stick to his guns even after being humiliated by Governor Newsom in his decision, because Governor Newsom used it as a green light to do a bunch of other crazy discrimination. And the idea this has anything to do with COVID is really nuts, in my opinion. But Roberts stuck with it. And so Roberts is going to pretend that anything that happens during the COVID era is okay. And I've been telling people about this. Tons of people wanted me to sue lots of people out of the gate. I brought selective suits across the country. Most of them got resolved. A couple went to court and we won. But I told people up front, challenging the COVID orders across the board is going to be hard because the courts have a long history. So I chose to find the most egregious examples and sued there. I told people when to bring church suits to wait or to bring the right one. So I brought a suit challenging the inability to even have a drive-in church service because that's laughably bad. Well, of course, all the smart governors and mayors have withdrawn those provisions when I brought suit. So it precluded that suit from going up to Supreme Court first. The ones that did were challenging the whole basis of what they're doing, and they're right constitutionally. It's just anyone who's studied American legal history knows our courts have never stopped governments from doing things during a crisis, ever. Every bad, horrific decision in the history of the Supreme Court has come during a crisis for the most part. And that's what's happened here. And unfortunately, Roberts is the classic Hampton cocktail party crowd kind of judge or justice who will not interfere with the executive branch or any other part of government when there's a perceived crisis. Even though he himself has been harshly critical of Korematsu, the reason why Korematsu, if he had been there in 1944, he would have made the exact same decision as the Korematsu court. I'd also been trying to tell all these lawyers to be more political and sensational with how they did their briefing. Unfortunately, a lot of them have decided not to follow that path. You have to. It's your only chance to get someone like Roberts' attention to say, hey, Roberts, I'm going to accuse you of being the same judge as the Korematsu court, that we have a trilogy of cases that live in infamy. The forced vaccination case of Jacobson, 1905, forced sterilizations in the 1920s, and the Buck case, another totally fraudulent case. And then the Korematsu case, of course, in 1944, all extreme deprivations of constitutional rights and liberties. Almost, they don't, there's a reason why they've only been citing Jacobson. Jacobson led to those two subsequent decisions, but notably those decisions are not being cited by any court because they know how embarrassing and humiliating it is. But the logic in all three is the same. And it's, hey, there's a crisis, so we're going to throw out the Constitution for the time being. And that's what's happening. And it's unfortunate. It's really egregious. And Gorsuch wrote a blistering dissent just to remind everybody of how egregious this was, that we're now favoring Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel. So credit to Gorsuch for doing that. But it's the legal situation we're going to live with as long as COVID is perceived as a serious threat. Even when, in my view, the empirical evidence does not substantiate that at all. As long as the media perceives it that way, that is, in fact, going to be how the courts rule. They will turn it increasingly, several gyms have lost their cases on these shutdown orders. So almost everybody is losing any big, substantial, broad challenge to the shutdown orders because courts are turning a blind eye to it. My cases have succeeded so far, but that's because I was more careful and selective in what we targeted. And then the big takings cases, I'm waiting on. So we're going to file them, but we're not rushing into the court system, because I know if you get into the court early, they're going to greenlight this. I want to wait for COVID to pass, then get the courts to address this. And if we can get them to address it outside of the crisis context, they may make very important rulings that will stop this from happening in the future. But right now, that's all we can frankly hope for, because the courts are shutting their doors to anybody contesting this abuse of power, because scary, scary pandemic must throw out Constitution, even though we had like 4 pandemics or the equivalent thereof at the time the Constitution was passed. So it's ludicrous from a legal history perspective, and in my view, from a constitutional perspective. But the courts are closed for the time being until people get back to a rational state of mind as to this pandemic.
And so ultimately, Gorsuch was of the dissenting for basically saying there's no rationale to applying a different standard to churches who can only seat a maximum of 50, regardless of their size, regardless of all the other accommodations, whereas theaters can have more than 50, casinos can be open, et cetera, et cetera. That's the bottom
exactly.
line.
I mean, you could have a small casino table or a small casino room that is smaller. There are plenty of small casinos here in Las Vegas, and I would say probably there are plenty of churches that are bigger than them. And so the point was, for square footage, it would be easy for these churches to accommodate more people than the rules allow, and still be fewer than what the casinos are already allowed, and just using the same social distancing and ventilation and so forth, and masks, etc. But that was not allowed. It was just clearly an arbitrary rule, and it was indisputably discriminatory. Notably, in this case, they didn't write anything for the majority. I think they just said 5-4, they turned it down, the injunction request. Gorsuch went out of his way to write a second dissent, if you will, because he dissented from the first case, and he just made clear how ludicrous this was. And it will increase pressure on Roberts, but my guess is Roberts will do nothing about this until it comes back around outside of the pandemic context. And Roberts probably won't do anything about it if Trump loses. If Trump wins, then something will happen with it. But otherwise, I think, unfortunately, I don't think anything else is going to come of it. It's clearly an absurd decision in my view. But it's in times of crisis is when the courts ignore the Constitution, and unfortunately, that's been proven once again.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, incidentally, funny anecdote. When I said I had a bit of a long week, our kids now have a bit of a cold, and I've got a cold as well. And the second anybody has a cold, you can't, in today's day and age, it's immediate freak out.
Yes.
And you have to live in that context. And it leads to the discussion, they're mandating the face masks across the country. And in Miami, is it Miami or Florida at large, where they're contemplating, or have they done it yet, mandating face masks in residences, in private?
I think it's both Miami and Palm Beach. I think there's a foreign country too that is mandating it indoors for the whole country, or contemplating it. I mean, and the thing here is there is scientific evidence that masks might work, but that's it. In fact, I was going through and preparing for the suit we're filing this week against Trader Joe's for discriminating on disability grounds, reading what the state of California had actually said. And what's fascinating is all their public health officials don't claim there's any scientific evidence to say that the masks are necessary. They say there is limited evidence that masks might be helpful. And it's extraordinary here, especially when you start doing the math. I mean, the math is that for 90% of the people, at least, probably 95, 96% of the people, they know do not have COVID, which means for them, there's no benefit to wearing the mask in terms of preventing its spread from that person. So it's on the speculative hunch that there's some asymptomatic people that are spreading it, and at such a viral level that even if you're 6 feet apart from them and you just pass them briefly, somehow you'll get it. There just isn't evidence to support that. And most of the mask evidence going back to influenza said that mask actually wouldn't reduce the spread of influenza in any meaningful manner. So, but I have tons of inquiries about suing. I'm going to start by bringing the disability claim, because there's more and more stores that don't recognize. There was a journalist that didn't recognize it, and he took down his tweet after I questioned him on it. But he thought people were making this up. And I was like, no, there's tons of people for a range of health reasons, some for just mental health, anxiety reasons, for whom masks is a risk. The CDC recognizes this. In fact, even the state of California says those people, quote, should not wear masks. Not only do they say they're exempt, they say they should not wear them. CDC says the same thing, because no state health authority wants to be blamed for causing someone's illness to get worse, or someone to die because they mandated they wear a mask when they knew it was a health risk for them to do so, more so than COVID spreading to them would be. It's recognized even within those standards that there's limitations on what these masks are. But what I've told people is don't expect anything from the courts. So I'm looking at careful selective challenges in the right context, in the right cases, right places, jurisdictions that have too broad a rule, et cetera, for the same reason as creating selective challenges out of the gate to COVID to get judges on the right side to start to move the needle some, because almost every court in the country is also requiring you wear masks inside.
Yeah, so that's why I think the mask challenge is not really it's not gonna go anywhere fast.
Not any broad mask challenge.
No,
the same judge who's making me wear a mask in the courtroom is going to say, you know what, it's insane to require masks. Unfortunately, not.
No, I think at the very least, maybe just admit of certain exceptions so that people stop freaking out when they see the 1 in 10 or the 1 in 20 not wearing a mask in public and breaking out the pepper spray. There was another incident, I forget where it was in the States, guys at a dog park outdoors and gets pepper sprayed by someone wearing a mask. I think the bottom line is, like, most people will concede that they probably do something. The only question is how much to justify the mandatory measures in comparison to the violation to constitutional rights that entails. Yes. And the other thing is, I think you would probably get to the same levels of compliance with or without the law, that you'd still have the same 5% who would refuse with or without the law. And then the question is, what's the purpose of the law, if not, on the one hand, to stigmatize and to possibly allow for, a second source of revenue for the government to go after these people and say, raise your defense later if you have one.
It becomes very conformist. It becomes very collectivist. It becomes once it's compulsory. I'm generally opposed to almost all compulsory laws of this kind. It's my argument about the draft. Is like I don't believe a draft is constitutional. It's never made sense to me that it could be constitutional. I know there's some people that interpret it vis-a-vis the Second Amendment militia requirement that you could draft people via the militia. So that means you could draft people for a national army. Actually, the whole point of a militia was to never have a national army. But putting that aside, there's a fundamental problem with saying, yes, you have constitutional rights, but I can take all of them away and force you to kill people. That doesn't strike me as inherently constitutional, but it's the same mindset. I've always said, look, people say, well, how would you fight a war? My view is if you can't persuade people to voluntarily fight in a war, then by golly, you shouldn't fight in that war. It becomes a little democratic check on it.
At the very least, maybe it's not for the interest. If the people don't feel the need to fight it, it might be for interests that are not aligned with the interests of those who you're sending off to do it.
Exactly.
And so, incidentally, someone here, Pink Sniper 28, says, if they mandate vaccinations for COVID, would you take a case opposing mandatory vaccinations?
Oh, yes, definitely. The question is going to be where and when and how. The same issue. It was bringing the most compelling case in the most politically favorable venue at the best time.